Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff. On the NewsHour tonight.
Together we will determine the course of America and the world for many, many years to come.
The United States has a new commander-in-chief. Donald J. Trump is sworn in as the 45th president. Mark Shields, David Brooks, Amy Walter, and others join me to analyze events of this Inauguration Day as the nation's political power shifts. Plus, protesters clash with police. Scores are arrested as some encounters across the capital city turn chaotic.
The point is to set a tone of resistance from the first moment that he's in office.
All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour. It's official. Donald J. Trump is the 45th president of the United States. Chief Justice John Roberts administered the oath at noon as Mr. Trump assumed his first public office. Here is how this Inauguration Day unfolded. For Donald and Melania Trump, the first public appearance of this inaugural day came at a morning church service at St. John's Episcopal in Washington. The president-elect had already begun his day around 4:30 a.m. with a trademark tweet. It proclaimed, "The movement continues. The work begins." Meanwhile, at the White House, the outgoing president left the traditional note for his successor on his Oval Office desk.
Morning, everybody. Morning, sir. Morning, sir.
And he took a final nostalgic stroll next to the Rose Garden.
Mr. President-elect, how are you?
The Obamas then welcomed the Trumps for a reception of coffee and tea before motorcading to the U.S. Capitol. Thousands had already gathered there despite a light rain and tight security, having faced protests at several security checkpoints as police in riot gear battled demonstrators elsewhere in the city. Overall, the crowd on the National Mall appeared well short of the one that celebrated Mr. Obama's first inauguration. More than 60 congressional Democrats boycotted the ceremony, but other dignitaries filled the west front of the Capitol, including former presidents Jimmy Carter, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, with his wife, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who lost the November election to Mr. Trump. Hail to the Chief played a final time for President Obama.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President-elect of the United States, Donald John Trump.
And then the President-elect himself was announced to cheers. Still, the political divisions laid bare in the election were on display. Scattered jeering greeted Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer when he addressed the crowd.
We face threats, foreign and domestic. In such times, faith in our government, our institutions, and even our country can erode. Despite these challenges, I stand here today confident in this great country for one reason: you, the American people.
The crowd cheered again when Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas administered the oath of office to Vice President Pence.
Would you raise your right hand and repeat after me?
The Mormon Tabernacle Choir performed America the Beautiful.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
And the nation's 45th president took the oath of office, administered by Chief Justice John Roberts. The new president was greeted by trumpets and cannon salutes and by scattered shouts of "Not my president." Then, as the rain resumed, Donald Trump delivered his first address as president, a message of economic populism that portrayed a nation struggling.
For too many of our citizens, a different reality exists. Mothers and children trapped in poverty in our inner cities. Rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation. an education system flush with cash, but which leaves our young and beautiful students deprived of all knowledge. And the crime, and the gangs, and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. This American carnage stops right here and stops right now.
Instead, the president declared a new vision will now guide the government. In his words, only America first.
I will fight for you with every breath in my body, and I will never, ever let you down. America will start winning again, winning like never before. We will bring back our jobs. We will bring back our borders. We will bring back our wealth. And we will bring back our dreams.
And he made clear he will hold official Washington to account for past failures and future progress.
We will no longer accept politicians who are all talk and no action, constantly complaining but never doing anything about it. The time for empty talk is over. Now arrives the hour of action. So to all Americans in every city, near and far, small and large, from mountain to mountain, from ocean to ocean, hear these words: you will never be ignored again. Your voice, your hopes, and your dreams will define our American destiny. Together, we will make America strong again. We will make America wealthy again. We will make America proud again. We will make America safe again. And yes, together, we will make America great again. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.
The ceremony concluded with the national anthem, sung by 16-year-old Jackie Evancho. With the peaceful transition of power complete, the new administration bid farewell to the past. William Brangham picks it up from there.
The first task for the newly sworn president and vice president, seeing their predecessors off. After a final hug, former Vice President Biden and his wife Jill hopped into a waiting motorcade and took an Amtrak train home to Wilmington, Delaware.
Hey, guys.
The Obamas boarded a military helicopter for the short trip to Joint Base Andrews in Maryland. There, Mr. Obama addressed hundreds of staffers from his White House years.
This has been the privilege of my life, and I know I speak for Michelle as well. We look forward to continuing this journey with all of you, and I can't wait to see what you do next. And I promise you I'll be right there with you. All right?
And with that, the former first couple flew to Palm Springs, California for a vacation. Back in Washington, a new, more violent protest broke out, with dozens arrested. But at the Capitol, the business of the day went ahead without interruption. In his first official acts, President Trump signed a proclamation calling for a National Day of Patriotism on September 11th. He also formally submitted his cabinet nominations to the Senate and signed a waiver that clears the way for his defense secretary pick, retired General James Mattis. From there, the Trumps entered Statuary Hall for the traditional post-inaugural luncheon and a presidential gesture to his defeated opponent.
I was very honored, very, very honored, when I heard that President Bill Clinton and Secretary Hillary Clinton was coming today, and I think it's appropriate to say, and I'd like you to stand up. I'd like you to stand up.
Then it was back outside for a ceremonial review of the troops and the trip down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol to the White House. Protests continued, but the parade proceeded without interruption. Along the way, the president got out to greet supporters. As the afternoon turned into the evening, the first family watched the parade from the White House viewing box. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm William Brangham.
So our John Yang was on the platform on the west side of the Capitol for today's inaugural ceremony. John, you had a view most of us didn't.
That's right, Judy. We were right there next to it. It was really interesting to watch. It was a fascinating day. It was full of tradition. It seemed like any other inaugural, but at the same time, it was different. That heckling during the administering of the oath that you talked about. And you had the living former presidents, all except George Herbert Walker Bush, who's hospitalized in Houston, all there to, I think, especially because of the contentious nature of this election, there to see the transfer of power. But at the same time, they didn't seem very enthusiastic about the speech. George W. Bush hardly applauded at all during the speech, looked rather stony-faced. And when a reporter asked him afterward what he thought of the speech, his reply was, "Good to see you again." Judy?
So, John, we reported that the new president has already signed some executive orders. A lot of it is routine, but some of it significant. What are you learning about what he plans to do in the first few days he's in office?
There's going to be a lot of activity. You're going to see a lot of executive orders signed in the first week, starting Monday, we're told, by Sean Spicer, the new White House press secretary. Those will be more substantive, dealing with policy. We're told that immigration certainly will be at the top of the list, trade issues, the sort of the issues that he ran on, that were the signatures of his campaign. A lot of them will be undoing what President Obama did over the past 8 years with executive actions because he faced obstacles in Congress. A lot of it will be furthering their own agenda. But they say they've got a plan, an action plan, not just for the first 100 days, but for the first 200 days.
Sounds like enough to keep you and the rest of the press following this new president really busy. John Yang, thank you. So what to make of this day one of the Trump presidency? Here with me now are NewsHour regulars, syndicated columnist Mark Shields and New York Times columnist David Brooks. And from our Politics Monday team, Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report. Also joining us, Barry Bennett. He was campaign manager for Ben Carson in the Republican primaries. He then served as an advisor to the Trump campaign. From George Washington University, political scientist Laura Brown. Karine Jean-Pierre, she was a senior advisor to MoveOn.org during the 2016 elections. And Matt Schlapp, he is chair of the American Conservative Union. He joins us from downtown Washington. We can see the Capitol behind you, Matt. So let me start with the NewsHour regulars, Mark Shields and David Brooks. David, I'll start with you. What is the main takeaway from this day?
I feel underdressed.
Yeah, man. Let's see it. It's got that blue-collar Republican look.
It's the new populist moment. The story of the day was the really unabashed populism and nationalism of the Trump speech. And so I'm left with two big questions. How big is this nationalist moment? It's been spreading around the world. Theresa May just gave how they're going to withdraw from Brexit. The UK, Le Pen is looking good in France. Putin is riding high. This is an international movement. A lot of us sort of dismiss it as sort of a product of a receding bit of history, but maybe it's the 21st century. And maybe Trump is riding something and he will be able to marshal a left-right populist movement. That's a possibility we should be open to, especially because the anti-populists, people who believe in global trade and global movement, have no guts, no articulation, and really no opposition. And then the second thing, how is he going to turn this into policy? How does an outsider who runs against Washington actually rally Washington to launch his agenda? That's just a gigantic challenge.
Mark Shields?
Judy, in 1940, there were 137 million people in the United States of America, and 132 million. And there were 600,000 more factory jobs than there are today. There were 8 million more factory jobs in this country than when Jimmy Carter was president of the United States. I mean, so Donald Trump represents a real grievance, a real constituency. But what I could not get over in the speech today, and I don't know what the global impact or meaning is, but I do know that it was unlike any inaugural address I have ever heard. It was a call to arms to those already enlisted in his army. There was no attempt to reach across the divide. There was no attempt to heal wounds. There was no attempt to reassure or allay fears of those who were apprehensive and not supportive. So in that sense, it was almost unique, at least in the speeches I've heard. And it was an unbridled attack upon those presidents spoke of, who were William's piece, who were sitting on the dais with him. Having praised the Obamas in one sentence for being magnificent, and then saying that this small group who've profited in Washington have been indifferent and almost cruelly so to the rest of the country. So I just stand in the Midnight in America and American Carnage, which is I think, soon-to-be canceled TV series. But I just have never heard language quite like it or a tone quite like it in an inaugural address.
Matt Schlapp, since you're so well dressed, I'm going to call on you next. What did you hear? What are you taking away?
Boy, what I'd say to Mark is that I think one of the things that was ironic is you had Donald Trump up on that dais, who hasn't been a Republican for very long, and who is basically a function of the fact that both those parties and many of those party leaders and some of those former presidents did not listen to the American people. President Obama will leave office with high approval ratings, but still 2/3 of this nation believe that we're on the wrong track. And I think the demonstration of the economic pain and the unrest and unease about what's happening overseas is high. And really what struck me about the address, about the speech, is that he is connecting to the political moment. The political moment is not about mourning. It's about a little bit about mourning, and the fact there's nothing wrong with a Republican connecting to the fact that a lot of Americans are hurting. Now, I agree you have to offer solutions and you have to be optimistic and you have to lead them someplace, but it's important to listen to them and to connect to them, and that's why Donald Trump is the president.
Amy Walter.
Yeah, and to Matt's point, there was a lot of Donald Trump on the campaign trail where he seemed to switch positions. We didn't really know, and I still think we don't know, where exactly his ideological core is. But there was one thing that was consistent throughout. It's the same message we saw today in his inaugural speech, was the message that we saw on the campaign trail, was the message that we saw at the convention. That has never changed at all. It's what won him the nomination when nobody thought he was going to be able to do that. And it's what won him the presidency when, quite frankly, even going into election night, nobody really believed that he was going to be able to win this. And so he is taking that same message and he is going to bring it to the White House with him. This was something that he truly, has, as I said, has stuck with throughout the course of his campaign. He believes that if he succeeds, other people are going to join. The reaching out is not about reaching out to say, well, I'm going to take other people's opinions and views. It's, I'm going to do so well. We're going to make America so great that people who oppose me now are going to have to come on board.
Is that what's going to happen? Karine Jean-Pierre, somebody who worked against his election.
Yeah, look, it was, and I've said this before, it was very disappointing. It was a right-wing nationalism speech. It was very reminiscent of the RNC convention speech when he accepted his nomination, had that dooms and glooms type of feel. And I think the most disappointing part of it was there are people here who are genuinely fearful because of the type of campaign that he ran and the people that he insulted. And he didn't do anything to mend those wounds. And as president, that's what people look to our leader to do. And I think he missed a really important opportunity as we were going through the peaceful transfer of power.
Barry Bennett missed an opportunity?
I don't think so. I think beauty in the eye is in the eye of the beholder here. His supporters, me included, we don't want half a loaf, right? We want him to fight. And today was the beginning of a fight. It wasn't the end of a campaign. We're going to see it from the left. The protests are big and energetic, and they're going to be so tomorrow. But we want him to fight back. And I think what we saw today was, he's Monday morning, the fight's still going to be there. And that's what I think the country needs.
Should people be fearful, as Karine was just saying?
I don't think so. No.
You shake your head no.
No, I mean, there are people here illegally. They should be fearful that they're here illegally, because they should be deported, or the law says they should be deported. But I mean, if you're here illegally, well, of course you're not going to be deported. That's silly. I mean, that's fear mongering.
We are looking, we've been interspersing our conversation with pictures of that inaugural parade still going on an hour after sunset here in Washington, but it's still going on. Members of the Trump family seated at that reviewing stand, just literally built right in front of the White House. We're watching that. We're keeping half an eye on the parade, but we also really want to hear what everybody here has to say. Laura Brown, it is dark at the White House, but Donald Trump is going to bring light to America.
Well, I think that's precisely the problem. Maybe he is going to continue to bring the fight to Washington, but there was no acknowledgement that he had won. His party has won. One of the most important aspects of an inaugural speech is to actually end the campaign, to move beyond the campaign, to bring about a sense of reconciliation and unity with all of those who fought fiercely against you. And I think there's also this other piece where he failed to recognize his moment in history. He did not acknowledge past presidents, those who are sort of lions in the pantheon of presidents, whether it's Thomas Jefferson or Abraham Lincoln or George Washington. He did not notice or witness the ceremony as being important in history. Bill Clinton, who came to office with only 43% of the popular vote, began his speech by talking about how this speech takes place in the dead of winter, but that part of the words and the faces of the people are about forcing the spring, that there is a sense of renewal, and Trump did not provide that.
Matt Schlapp, and we should say the reason you are dressed up is because you are going to one of the inaugural balls, and I failed to point that out earlier. Or
no,
maybe...
I think, Judy, I think it's because they think people like me live like Thurston Howell III. Come on, be honest.
What about Laura Brown's point, though, that we didn't hear from the new president a connection to history, to his place in the grand pantheon that is the history of the United States?
Look, if you want poetry, there was another candidate for you. Donald Trump was a candidate of very blunt, realistic talk. And I think if you look through what politicians tend to do, and obviously I worked for President George W. Bush in the White House with Barry Bennett's wife, I might say. And there is definitely great thought that goes into these speeches. But so many times what the voter hears and then what they see in their lives, there can be a bit of phoniness, obviously, to politics. And I think what Donald Trump did, what everyone on the panel is failing to understand is that I think the biggest part of the speech was that he broke it down in very basic terms for them, and he made a pledge to them. He said he's going to fight for them, and he's not going to let them down. Boy, it's not a small pledge. This is a high bar to meet, which is he's going to literally change society and change the way government does these things. And I think that it was bold for him to do that. And I think there was a lot of people, I'll tell you, I talked to a lot of people out on the street today, and they just like the fact that there's an authenticity and a directness. We'll see how it works over the years, but I think it's very promising.
David Brooks, bold and authentic.
Utopian. I mean, he's going to eradicate disease. He literally said that. So I think it was authentic, and I do think it was bold. Boldest mostly in its attack on the Republican Party. This is a party that has always never believed in zero-sum thinking. It started as a Whig party, which was based on the idea in part that labor and capital didn't have to fight. There was enough for all of us in a growing pie. The Republican Party, through all its permutations, has basically believed in that. Since the Cold War, it's believed in growth abroad is good for growth at home. Democracy abroad is good for democracy at home. That's not an America First philosophy. That's not the zero-sum philosophy that we heard from Donald Trump. That's not the combative philosophy we heard from Donald Trump. So it's a stark and a bold attempt to reshape his own party. Whether he can successfully do that, I'm frankly dubious about. And whether he can successfully effect change in government when he is so anti-institutional and not even willing to embrace the institution of the presidency, is, again, I'm dubious about. But bold, I give him credit for.
Mark Shields, just quickly, did you hear signs, did you see signals today that Donald Trump will be able to make the changes he says he's going to make?
No, I didn't. I mean, I did not see anything unifying or uplifting in the speech. And I think that successful inaugurals in the past, I mean, they may be writing a new chapter, but I did not. I thought that was missing from the speech.
But you're saying that's what we should be judging the speech on.
I think you have to view the speech as identifying yourself in history, acknowledging who you are, acknowledging humility, acknowledging the importance of the country and its diversity and its strength through that diversity, and your appeal to the people who didn't support you and your pledge to them. To me, it's politics 101. I mean, he was playing to his base. He's continuing to play to his base. And if Matt isn't too busy going to his nighttime affairs, he can tell us who the candidate of poetry was in 2016. Was that Rick Perry? Did I miss it? Or was it Scott Walker? I missed it.
I wish we. Do you want to answer
Hillary
that just
Clinton.
quickly?
It definitely wasn't Hillary Clinton.
We'll bring you back on. You can answer that. I won't put you on the spot. We've only got about a minute left. Amy, I'm hearing two very different sets of views here about what Donald Trump accomplished or didn't today.
His goal was to, and it's been his goal from the entire course of this campaign, he has a vision and a message about shaking up Washington. He's going to do things differently. He's not going to do it in a traditional manner. He doesn't care about the trappings of this. And you either believe that or you don't believe that. And he will be successful based on a Washington working for him, despite the fact that he doesn't think Washington works.
Well, we have how many days? 365 times 4 to talk about what he accomplished today and what he may accomplish in the future. I want to thank each one of you, Mark Shields, David Brooks, Amy Walter, Laura Brown, Karine Jean-Pierre, Barry Bennett, and Matt Schlapp. You all get a chance to come back and weigh in one more time, or many more times on this. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Judy.
Well, as we heard, there were vocal opponents of the president, thousands of them protesting across Washington throughout this day. Most of them were peaceful, but a number of incidents turned violent late this afternoon. A limousine was set on fire downtown. Smoke could be seen for blocks away. And protesters hurled trash cans, flash bombs, and objects at police who used pepper spray in return. By this evening, at least 217 people were arrested. 6 police officers were injured. Jeffrey Brown and our team have been out on the streets all day. Here's what they saw.
It was a disparate group of protesters coming together to march, express their resistance to the new administration, and air their anger at what some see as an illegitimate president.
I couldn't just sit at home and let this be like Trump's administration be normalized.
Robbie Disu is an organizer of one of the lead umbrella groups called Disrupt J20 Inauguration Day.
Our goal is to disrupt it, just like our name says, and we've definitely been disrupting it all day.
Disrupting, but in a few moments from now when we're talking, Donald Trump will be president.
Yeah, but we were not under any impression that we would stop him from becoming president. The point is to set a tone of resistance from the first moment that he's in office.
One act of disruption at security checkpoints leading into the National Mall, demonstrators attempted to block access to the inauguration, chaining themselves together and refusing to move. In another, protesters shut down part of a major highway near the Capitol. McPherson Square here in downtown Washington, D.C. has been ground zero for protesters all day. From here, different groups have fanned out around the city, some marching peacefully, others more violent. At times, the peaceful burst into the violent. After a tense standoff at 12th and K Streets, police used pepper spray and flash grenades to disperse the crowd. Elsewhere, protesters dressed in black threw rocks and flash bombs and smashed windows, leading to more confrontations, injuries, and arrests. These demonstrators used tactics associated with so-called black bloc anarchist groups, long prevalent in Europe, often seizing the moment amid more peaceful protests. This afternoon, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser said in a statement, Again, I respect your right to peacefully protest, but the damage that has occurred today is unacceptable and not welcome in D.C. For most who came out, though, today was a day to come together and plan for the future. I spoke with this couple who came from New Hampshire.
There's a lot of folks who feel like they aren't heard, that they're not represented, that their voices do not matter in any way, shape, and or form. And it's just reminding folks that even though he is president, we respect that fact because that fact is a fact. That does not mean that over the next 8 years, whatever it ends up happening, that those voices won't matter, that those voices will not be a part of the conversation, that those thoughts and those opinions will not be a part of the conversation. I just want to make it a point to say that they will.
The National Park Service gave out 22 permits for First Amendment events, considerably more than in previous inaugurations, when some half dozen were requested. More than 3,000 police and 5,000 National Guard were on hand, and security expenses for the day are expected to exceed $100 million. Protests today also occurred well beyond Washington, from marches in Denver to across San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge, and around the world. In London, demonstrators unfurled banners from bridges with messages for the new president, among them to build bridges, not walls. In Tokyo, hundreds of people, most of them women, marched through the night streets in protest of Mr. Trump's presidency.
And Jeff joins me now. He's still in downtown Washington. Jeff, you've been there all day. Where do things stand right now?
Well, I mean, you can hear all around me sirens in one corner, a band playing in another corner, police off right behind me. It's been a very unusual day here in Judy in Washington, and it is an extremely unusual evening. It's calmer right now than it was. I'm standing actually right at the spot. We're right outside the Washington Post. This is where that limousine, that car was set on fire that you showed our audience the video of from a little earlier. It's a little calmer now. There's a very large security presence now. There's more protesters down at the other end. And actually, I see some flames right there, but I don't think that's a major fire at the moment, but we'll watch that. It's a little calmer, but and we've been told that for the most part, at least the main coalition groups are not planning any more activities tonight, but maybe these smaller groups that cause more of the trouble. And the thinking really is that it is these smaller groups that have caused most of the trouble. You don't quite know what's going to happen with them later on, but for the most part, I think we may have seen it's a little calmer now.
In just a few seconds, Jeff, we saw you talking to some of the protesters. Do you get the sense that they feel their message is being heard?
Well, Judy, I think it's more about, and I was listening to the conversation you were just having, I think it's more about what's next, where do they go from here? They wanted to make sure that they were here, that they were showing that they exist, that they have a message, and that they can press things ahead. And it was about meeting people and speaking up and sort of organizing to see where they go from here. But I think that, of course, just as you were saying with the guest earlier, that's really the big question for people in the streets as well. What's next?
Jeffrey Brown out on the streets all day long for the NewsHour. Thank you.
All day, Judy.
Really fine reporting. We thank you.
Thanks.
Well, since the November election, there has been a lot of talk about how well Mr. Trump connected with those voters who felt ignored or looked down upon by politicians. Today, they had their moment to be heard. Our Lisa Desjardins was on the Mall to listen to what some Trump supporters had to say.
They came from across the country, many at their first inauguration, on a gray day that didn't dampen their excitement or hope. Marion Carpenter and Larry Sanders drove up from South Carolina yesterday.
We intend to follow them all the way.
They traveled here with their church group. They said because before Trump, they'd seen their way of life disappearing.
Your steel mills are gone. Your coal industry's gone. People are hurting for jobs.
The crowd did not reach as far down the National Mall as at President Obama's inaugurations, but it was a devoted group. Joseph Zeta from Ohio hit on a theme for many Trump supporters, that seeing President Trump take office eased years of personal frustration.
I started being interested in politics midway through Obama's second term, so it's like, as a Republican, it's being told, oh, your ideas are stupid, and finally, look, we're here. We're making America great again.
I'm a Marine mom, she's a Navy mom.
Kelly Hazley and Marion Byers are from Indiana. Friends since high school. They drove 9 hours to be here. To them, Mr. Trump represents a change in national priorities.
It's been a real disappointment for 8 years, and it's time that we get back to grassroots and family values. We're going to make America military. Amen.
I just don't feel our troops have been supported, and looking forward to them having a president, a commander-in-chief that's going to do that for them, that loves America.
Here, too, were some from a Democratic base, unions like ironworker Tom Dwyer, who fought back pain to make it here. He's a New Yorker, like Mr. Trump, and doesn't trust politicians.
He's a man of his word. I believe, like I said, I grew up in New York, in Queens, and he's just part of the woodwork in New York. So when he says he's going to do something, I believe that he's going to do it, and he's going to make it shine.
Most came for Mr. Trump, but many, like these Delaware middle schoolers, came just to witness the peaceful transfer of power itself. Some of their parents admitted they didn't support the new president, but told us their trip was about more. For the PBS NewsHour from the National Mall in Washington, I'm Lisa Desjardins.
So in addition to the protest today, there are plans for much more to come tomorrow. Women from around the country are making their way to the nation's capital, with others preparing for events in cities around the globe. The crowds on the National Mall on Saturday are expected to be in the hundreds of thousands. William Brangham recently sat down at the museum with two organizers of tomorrow's march, Bob Bland and Carmen Perez. William began by asking them what they hope to accomplish.
We are bringing together women, men, and allies from all different types of communities from all over the country to say that we are standing in solidarity together to say that women's rights are human rights.
We are coming here so that we could show this new administration that we're not going anywhere, right? And there are so many more of us that are actually united than we are divided. This march on Washington is to ensure that Congress, our new president, and the Senate know that we're going to continue to fight for our rights, that we're going to protect the most marginalized communities.
What are you marching for, and what are you marching against?
So we are marching to continue to allow women to make decisions about their bodies and ensure we have reproductive justice rights, immigration reform, criminal justice reform, as well as indigenous rights. So there's so many things. We've been extremely intentional about allowing organizations to get involved, Planned Parenthood, as well as Define American.
And every woman has their own reason for marching. So that's the really beautiful thing about this. We've seen through the last 18 months and everything that's happened that we can be complacent no longer.
There are so many specifics in your guiding principles, everything from minimum wage to reproductive rights to environmental concerns to indigenous people's concerns. Why was it important to you to be so specific in the things that you're marching for?
We wanted to make sure that there was a mission, there was a vision, that we started organizing for something, not against something, right? So this is not a march against Trump. This is a march on Washington, Congress, the Senate, our president.
I hear what you're saying, that this is not against Trump, but the timing of it couldn't be more obvious. Is there something about his administration that you guys are particularly concerned about?
Well, we saw an increase in this country in instances of bigotry and racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny. A lot of this came to the forefront, and these conversations came to the forefront during the election cycle.
Some of the guiding principles that you've laid out seem to really place a lot of emphasis on the concerns of women of color, immigrant women. Was that intentional?
It was intentional, especially because our new president-elect was attacking a lot of these communities with some of his racist rhetoric around Mexicans and building a wall. And I'm Mexican-American myself. Linda Sarsour, one of our national co-chairs, is Muslim-American. We need to have courageous conversations. Sometimes we don't speak about religion and politics and race because we don't want to offend anyone, but how are we going to learn? Right, exactly. So that's what this march has been able to do, is to create a very safe space and an honest space where we could have these difficult, quote-unquote, courageous conversations so that we could move forward together as a country.
What would you say to a young woman of color who has heard about what they might see as a feminist march or a feminist action in the past and felt excluded from that, and they think, I'm not going to do this?
What I would say to a young woman of color who doesn't feel like this march or even feminism has ever been for them, I would say we need you. We welcome you. There's many moments where I never saw somebody like myself reflected in leadership, and that's why I've taken that role now.
Is there any concern that because this march is happening the day after Trump becomes president and is clearly targeted in some ways at the Trump administration, that you might alienate a part of the country who may have supported Trump or may have been a Republican, or that you might end up driving people away because this is seen as a partisan day?
I will say we welcome everybody who actually supports women's rights. And so if you're a Republican, if you're a Democrat, if you are Green Party, whatever party you are, we welcome you to be a part of this. And so I believe that there are many women who voted for Trump who are also coming.
You think that's right? You think you're going to have women who will support Trump that will be here on Saturday?
I believe that, you know, people who feel connected to women's rights are going to be there.
And I think that there are many, many conservative women who did not vote for Trump. And they have been emailing us and saying, yes, we want to stand in solidarity against misogyny and for our rights as women. And so I think it's a moment where we can look at what does it mean to be conservative? Are you Republican or are you Democrat? And that's it. I think we're all people first.
How will you measure whether or not Saturday is a success?
For us, this impact will be something that reverberates across the country and across the world for quite a while. And so, you know, we will see what the long-term impact of it is. But I think that's also up to the marchers. I think it's up to them to take their power and use it.
I agree.
You think Donald Trump will be watching?
I think he'll be tweeting.
All right. Bob Bland, Carmen Perez, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
The new president is already weighing in on some policy matters. Within minutes of the swearing in today, the White House website carried new statements. One promised a, quote, state-of-the-art missile defense system to protect against attacks from states like Iran and North Korea. Another condemned what it called the dangerous anti-police atmosphere in America and promised it will end. At the same time, the website dropped all mention of climate change. The inauguration also reverberated around the world. In Moscow, Russians welcomed the new president with posters, special sales, and parties, anticipating better relations with the U.S. And in a statement, Pope Francis urged President Trump to, quote, be guided by the rich spiritual values that have shaped the history of the American people, especially, he said, concern for the poor. Meanwhile, the U.S. Senate late this afternoon confirmed the first of Mr. Trump's cabinet nominees. Former Marine General James Mattis was approved as Secretary of Defense. And John Kelly, another former Marine general, won confirmation to head the Department of Homeland Security. The Mexican drug lord El Chapo Guzman pleaded not guilty today in New York to federal drug trafficking charges. He was extradited yesterday from Mexico after twice escaping from prison there. Federal prosecutors in Brooklyn said today that it's time he faced justice.
Guzman's destructive and murderous rise as an international narcotics trafficker is akin to that of a small cancerous tumor that metastasized and grew into a full-blown scourge that for decades littered the streets of Mexico with the casualties of violent drug wars over turf. And the same scourge helped to perpetrate the drug epidemic here in the U.S.
Mexican officials said the timing of the extradition was not related to the inauguration of President Trump. In central Italy, a dramatic scene played out as rescue crews found 10 people alive in a resort hotel crushed by an avalanche. They are among some 30 people thought to be trapped after the massive snowslide on Wednesday. Workers captured the moment today that 2 survivors were pulled from the snow, one of them a young boy, amid cheers from the crews.
They
survived thanks to this bubble of air that formed inside the hotel. Finding them was really tough because not only were we working in the middle of the debris, but we also had snow to deal with. It's like an earthquake in the snow. It's hard to describe. It's something unbelievable. It's awful.
So far, the crews have also found 4 bodies. There is word that the defeated president of Gambia has agreed to step aside, apparently ending a political crisis. Officials in neighboring Senegal say final arrangements are still being worked out. Senegal and other West African states had sent in troops to force Yahya Jammeh to give up. The man who beat him in last month's election, Adama Barrow, says what he terms Jammeh's rule of fear is over. In economic news, China's growth last year was the slowest since 1990. Beijing reported today that the growth rate ran at 6.7%. And on Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrial Average broke a 5-day losing streak and gained nearly 95 points today to close at 19,827. The Nasdaq rose 15 and the S&P 500 added 7. It is up 6% since the election. Finally tonight, as former President Obama now embarks on life after the White House, flying to California for vacation, few people had as intimate a view of him as the man tasked with taking his picture. John Yang is back with that story.
For the past 8 years, Pete Souza has watched history through the viewfinder of his camera.
To walk into the Oval Office every day, to walk along the colonnade, to photograph this man every day has just been a unique experience.
He was behind the scenes for world-changing events like the May afternoon in 2011 when U.S. Special Forces killed Osama bin Laden.
This is in, the Situation Room. You can see the faces how tense this was to watch. The interesting thing to me is you can see the Brigadier General that's sitting in what would be considered the president's chair, and he stood up to give the president his chair, and the president's like, no, you stay where you're at because you're in control here, and I'll just pull up a chair.
There were days of sadness, like preparing for the 2012 prayer service for the young victims of the Newtown, Connecticut school shooting. It meant President Obama would miss his own daughter's dance recital. Instead, he went to her dress rehearsal.
Sasha's participation was, I think, in 3 of the 16 performances. So when she was dancing, he was totally focused on watching her. And then when she left the stage and other people were dancing, he was editing his speech. And you can see just that little subtle look on his face. He's still very emotional.
Emotions that would touch Souza as well.
Newtown was the one time where I had tears. It was very difficult to watch him greet these families. Just imagine all of them meeting a president for the first time in the worst of circumstances. And I would say that was the one time where emotionally I couldn't hide how I was feeling.
And you're not just capturing the moments of history, the big moments of the presidency, you're capturing the small human moments as well.
And to me, those are probably my favorite moments is little unexpected gems, as I call them, that happen on occasion.
Like this otherwise routine Oval Office meeting with a departing staff member and his family.
The man's son, Jacob, asked the president if he could feel his head because his friends had told him that he had the exact same haircut as the president. So President Obama just kind of leaned down and Jacob feels his head and click. Over the years, this has kind of taken on somewhat of an iconic status just because it showed the kind of person he is, meaning President Obama.
Did you have any sense that it would become so iconic, so symbolic?
Absolutely not. Even after we posted it on whitehouse.gov, I just didn't realize how significant it would become.
It's one of many images Souza has captured of Mr. Obama with children.
I feel the joy and the disbelief that the President of the United States is lying on the rug of the Oval Office, hoisting up a little girl in her elephant costume. There's that picture of him flexing muscles with Superman or getting zapped by Spider-Man.
Were you surprised when he sort of flies back when Spider-Man slings the web?
Sure. I mean, it's like completely unexpected, and I always tell people that the only pressure in my job is to make sure I'm ready for those moments and try not to mess them up.
After 2 terms, the president jokes about his graying hair. But Souza says the man he sees through his camera lens has been constant.
You know, I got to say that the core character of this man has not changed one iota. I mean, I think he's still the same person he was that I met in January of 2005 when he was first elected to the Senate. Has he gotten older? Well, sure. I mean, but, you know, this is what happens, not just to a president, but in terms of like his character, I honestly don't think he has changed at all.
For the PBS NewsHour, I'm John Yang at the White House.
Whatever your political views, you have to admire those photos. And you can watch our entire series, The Obama Years, in which we spoke to many leaders in the outgoing administration. That's on our website, pbs.org/newshour. On the NewsHour online right now, hear are the voices of the inauguration. We talked to 7 Americans who are in Washington during the transfer of power to observe, to celebrate, or protest the beginning of the Trump administration. Plus, you can also read the full transcript of President Trump's inauguration speech and find a fact check of his statements. You can test your knowledge with our inauguration trivia quiz and follow along on our live blog for news, analysis, and photos of all this big day's events. That and much more on this day of change is on our website, pbs.org/newshour. Later tonight on PBS on Washington Week, a closer look at how the new Trump administration's policy proposals may change the lives of average Americans. That's later tonight on Washington Week. And this weekend on PBS NewsHour Weekend, continuing coverage of President Trump's first days in office, the Women's March on Washington, and candid conversations with exiting members of Congress. And we will be back right here on Monday. You can count on it. That's the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Judy Woodruff. What an incredible day. Have a great weekend. Thank you, and good night.
You're watching PBS.
Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff. On the NewsHour tonight.
Together we will determine the course of America and the world for many, many years to come.
The United States has a new commander-in-chief. Donald J. Trump is sworn in as the 45th president. Mark Shields, David Brooks, Amy Walter, and others join me to analyze events of this inauguration day as the nation's political power shifts. Plus, protesters clash with police. Scores are arrested as some encounters across the capital city turn chaotic.
The point is to set a tone of resistance from the first moment that he's in office.
All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour. It's official. Donald J. Trump is the 45th President of the United States. Chief Justice John Roberts administered the oath at noon as Mr. Trump assumed his first public office. Here is how this Inauguration Day unfolded. For Donald and Melania Trump, the first public appearance of this inaugural day came at a morning church service at St. John's Episcopal in Washington. The president-elect had already begun his day around 4:30 a.m. with a trademark tweet. It proclaimed, "The movement continues, the work begins." Meanwhile, at the White House, the outgoing president left the traditional note for his successor on his Oval Office desk.
Morning, sir.
And he took a final nostalgic stroll next to the Rose Garden.
Mr. President, how are you?
The Obamas then welcomed the Trumps for a reception of coffee and tea before motorcading to the U.S. Capitol. Thousands had already gathered there despite a light rain and tight security, having faced protests at several security checkpoints as police in riot gear battled demonstrators elsewhere in the city. Overall, the crowd on the National Mall appeared well short of the one that celebrated Mr. Obama's first inauguration. More than 60 congressional Democrats boycotted the ceremony, but other dignitaries filled the west front of the Capitol, including former presidents Jimmy Carter, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, with his wife, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who lost the November election to Mr. Trump. Hail to the Chief played a final time for President Obama.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President-elect of the United States, Donald John Trump.
And then the President-elect himself was announced to cheers. Still, the political divisions laid bare in the election were on display. Scattered jeering greeted Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer when he addressed the crowd.
We face threats, foreign and domestic. In such times, faith in our government, our institutions, and even our country can erode. Despite these challenges, I stand here today confident in this great country for one reason: you, the American people.
The crowd cheered again when Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas administered the oath of office to Vice President Pence.
Would you raise your right hand and repeat after me?
The Mormon Tabernacle Choir performed America the Beautiful.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
And the nation's 45th president took the oath of office, administered by Chief Justice John Roberts. The new president was greeted by trumpets and cannon salutes and by scattered shouts of "Not my president." Then, as the rain resumed, Donald Trump delivered his first address as president, a message of economic populism that portrayed a nation struggling.
For too many of our citizens, a different reality exists. Mothers and children trapped in poverty in our inner cities. Rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation. An education system flush with cash, but which leaves our young and beautiful students deprived of all knowledge. And the crime and the gangs